A lot of stereotypes live on, long past their expiration date and long after everything about them has been debunked. MSG is perfectly safe to eat. Cracking your knuckles does not cause arthritis. Vaccines do not and never have caused autism. And men may have more trouble with emotion than do women in leadership roles. My name is Eric Bowman. I'm the communications specialist at the Canadian Psychological Association, and this is Mindful. Today's guest, along with her colleagues Ivana Haydig and Tanya Henschel, studied the leadership of both men and women during the COVID pandemic and found a stereotype-busting result. It was women who were best able to regulate their emotional response and provide compassionate, capable leadership during a major crisis. Let's talk about it.
My name is Winny Shen. I'm an associate professor of organization studies at the Schulich School of Business at York University.
And you've recently completed a study that sort of upends some of the notions that we have about leadership. For a long time, there's been a stereotype that women are more emotional and therefore less effective as leaders because they lead with emotion and so on. And your study says, it actually seems to be the opposite of what's true. Can you just give me a little bit of an overview?
Sure. So this is a study that we conducted with some colleagues kind of early on during the pandemic. And we were very interested in how, given all this upheaval, how leaders were experiencing the pandemic, the emotions they were experiencing, and how it affected how they led. So in particular, we focused on two emotions that we thought was most relevant given the uncertainty that was going on during the beginning phase of the pandemic. And so that was anxiety and also hope. So these are kind of two common emotions that people often feel when they're uncertain. But the way in which anxiety and hope differs in that is that people who often feel a little bit more control often say they feel more hopeful about uncertain events or situations, whereas people who feel less control often just experience anxiety. Right. And then what we find is that in turn, anxiety was associated with the tendency to act abusively amongst leaders, whereas hope was associated with providing more family supportive supervision. So caring for your subordinates' families, or kind of giving them indication that, this is a place that, or you are a person and this is an organization that supports that there are whole people, have families, have other responsibilities. But the caveat is we find that these effects differ by leader gender, such that really anxiety only leads to abusive supervision amongst men leaders and not female leaders. And similarly, hope is only associated with family supportive supervisor behaviors for for men leaders and not women leaders. And in contrast, women leaders tend to pretty much do very little abusive supervision regardless of how anxious they feel. They kind of were able to keep that at a relatively low level. And similarly, their subordinates really reported them providing relatively high levels of family supportive supervisory behaviors regardless of how hopeful they felt. Right. So it's really interesting in that men leaders leadership behaviors was really dependent on how they were feeling, whereas female leaders were not. They were kind of doing things regardless of how they felt about kind of the pandemic situation.
Right. And that was the part I found most fascinating. So you're looking at anxiety, you're looking at hope, and you're saying that people who have more anxiety, specifically in the context of the pandemic here, tend to be more abusive as leaders. And that when you look at female leaders versus male leaders, female leaders tend to have more anxiety about things than men do. But the caveat being that the women actually don't translate that anxiety into the abusive behaviors that you otherwise see. So I guess the question that I have then is this specifically a pandemic thing that you're looking at? And does that translate to leadership as a whole? Because I'm thinking the pandemic is in a uniquely stressful situation, a uniquely difficult thing that managers have to overcome. But management and leadership and leaders have to deal with stressful situations, with uncertainty, with all kinds of, emergencies that occur. all the time, regardless of whether they're as big as the pandemic. So would this be translatable to something outside of that?
Yeah, so ultimately, I think that's an empirical question. We think it would. I think the way we view it is we think that the pandemic is, as you mentioned, a very strong event, right? It was novel, it was very impactful in a number of different ways. And so, in some ways, I think the pandemic is kind of an extreme case of, the stressors, the
Right.
events that leaders have to deal with day to day. But we would assume that, how people often lead is to some extent, to us, there's no per se reason to expect that the cues that leaders are attending to, either consciously or unconsciously when they lead, would be different under different circumstances. So we believe that this is likely to generalize, though of course we don't know, right? Our study only took place within this very specific period of time. And it's also a little bit interesting because in some ways, as you mentioned, our study does support in some sense that women are more emotional in that they felt more anxiety. But I think, people often conflate this idea of experiencing more emotions or emotions more strongly with the idea that that equates to a lack of emotional control. And I think
Right.
that is really where we don't find much evidence for that, right? And instead, men's behaviors are more strongly affected by their emotions.
And I think it stands to reason that if you maintained a pretty even emotional keel and didn't let your emotions dictate the way that you led during a hugely stressful event like the pandemic, that would translate to something that's a little bit less stressful or a little bit less of a disruption of the way that the workplace functions. And you say that this I read in your Harvard Business Review article that you connected this with emotional labor theory. And I'm hoping you can explain to me what that is. What is
Yeah.
emotional labor theory and how does that connect here?
Yeah, so I think emotional labor theory really gets into the idea that sometimes there can be a disconnect between the emotions we experience or feel and the emotions that we might show others, right? And that's not always one to one. And here we're kind of making this idea or assumption that although women are reporting feeling these emotions, that they are kind of stopping it with them, that they are, not necessarily expressing these emotions or at least letting it affect how they interact with other people. Now, I think what's really interesting, which we don't know, that I'm hoping we can look into in future research, is that sometimes there can be costs to performing this emotional labor, right? Like if you think about it, it takes energy and resources to manage your emotions when you feel one thing but you feel like maybe it's in the best interest of your work group that you don't necessarily show those emotions that you're feeling. And so I think one of the things we're really interested in is, are women bearing some costs of this emotional labor or not? On one hand, maybe they aren't. There's some evidence, for example, that if you can engage in what we call deep acting, if you're really good at regulating your emotion, you can almost like what good actors do, right? They can
Right.
reach back into a memory or an experience and kind of help them to shape, their emotional experience so that it's somewhat different. The emerging research suggests that deep acting often doesn't have as severe of costs because you are successful somewhat in kind of changing your emotions, even though your original emotion was maybe anxiety. Now, what's less effective is if you are engaging in surface acting. You're just pasting on a smile. You continue to feel a lot of anxiety, right? But you make your mouth upturn. And so I think that's a piece that we don't really know yet from this research what's going on in terms of there's clearly evidence that women appear to be regulating their emotions differently. Are they doing so in ways that are more or less costly to themselves and their well-being? We don't know. So that's for future research, hopefully.
Interesting. I like that analogy of the actor, right? The method actor who gets
Yeah.
super into the role, and who's really obnoxious on set because everyone who talks to them is talking to the character that they're playing for the 3 months that they're, doing this.
Yeah.
Like, although there has been a lot of research done, and it seems quite clear that during the pandemic itself, women bore the brunt of emotional labor at home as well as at work.
Mhm.
Even if the woman was the primary breadwinner in the family and had the job that was the most important to keeping the family together, still was expected to do more of the work around the house, more of taking care of the children, more of getting them to their Zoom classes at school on time and that sort of thing, regardless of the dynamic in the professional world, right? And I wonder if that's something that came up in the course of this research that you were doing.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So, funnily enough, it didn't come up so much in this research, a little bit more implicitly, but we were also doing some other work during the pandemic, and we definitely found in related kind of separate research that we were doing in the pandemic that women were definitely, as you say, engaged in more of this. We often call it cognitive labor, right? The kind of the thinking, the planning that often goes, the deciding that often goes into the researching, into caring for household members. Research suggests it's disproportionate with even prior to the pandemic, but that there was a lot of uncertainty, which means there was a lot of things to understand, process, decide about, and that women definitely seem to bear a disproportionate load of that within households. And in this other research that we were conducting, what we found was that that was definitely related to emotional exhaustion and burnout amongst women. And unfortunately, what we also found is that experience of burnout as the result of doing kind of this added labor was related to women wanting to exit the workforce. They had stronger turnover intentions, and they also felt like they were not as adaptable in their career. So it seemed to
Mhm.
definitely come at some work-related cost for these women in terms of the fact of having to do more of this work. Though we looked at that primarily in the household domain in that study, but it is interesting to consider, is the fact that are women also doing more of this in the workplace, the worrying and caring about other, the people in their work group, and if that is also coming at some cost to them or draining them more, I think is a important and interesting question.
Right. So when you talk about the toll that it may take on
Yeah,
leaders or female leaders in the workplace and the cost to them, you're talking about something similar, the burnout, the exhaustion that comes with doing it at home.
exactly. Yeah, and especially if we put these threads together, there's the possibility if women are doing it at work, they're doing it at home, a big part of overcoming, this kind of exhaustion is recovery. Then there's no time to rest, right? If I'm
Right.
worried about everyone else, then there's no time to really detach or, in order, which we know is super important for recovery.
You talk a little bit too about the stereotype that has existed for a long time, the idea that rational leaders are better leaders. And I guess rational, you could read unemotional,
Mhm.
emotionless, right? That you lead without. But you say that, in fact, some emotions are good for leaders and it's good for them to feel them and it's good for them to incorporate them into the work that they do. Can you give me maybe some examples of some emotions that make people better as leaders?
Yeah, so I think that increasingly emotion research suggests that there is no such thing as bad emotions to some extent, right? Emotions are, from an evolutionary sense, people often think about emotions are signals. They just tell us that, they raise an alarm. There's something to pay attention to, good or not good, right? And so that there is usually a purpose for that. Now, I think that we can overreact to emotions, and sometimes we can overemphasize them, and that can create problems sometimes, but I don't think fundamentally the research suggests that there are bad emotions. Now, I think that there's a lot of evidence that in general it can often help to be a leader who experiences a lot of positive emotions, right? And I think that's often because there's some evidence, right, that positive emotions broaden and build. So, they cause us to think about things in a more open way. Right? It's a signal, these positive emotions, that things are going well. And sometimes that gives us the security and the comfort to be like, okay, either I can keep doing what I'm doing, it's working, right? Or things are going well. I can really explore. I can take a chance. I can be creative, right? I can innovate. And that's often very beneficial to work performance. Now, of course, there's definitely an impact and a place for leader negative emotions. But I think that negative emotion signals that something's wrong, right? So I think the danger is if you're a leader who expresses a lot of negative emotions all the time, then that can be very stressful for your subordinates, right?
Yeah.
Because it's basically like, my leader seems to think that there's something wrong, like all the time, right? Which means that like we're not doing well constantly. And I think that's a really stressful situation to be in for
Yes.
employees in terms of like, why is my leader unhappy? Like, what is wrong, right? Does that mean layoffs are coming? Does that mean our performance is bad? Does that mean I'm about to get called into their office to get told that, I'm not going to get a promotion? So I think, the thing about negative emotions is it signals to the employee that something is wrong. So often they spend a lot of time thinking about it. But, if you're just in a grumpy mood, your employees may be spending a lot of time over interpreting, why you seem to be in such this negative mood and what that means for them in ways
Yes.
that might take away from, actually their actual work.
For sure. And we started this discussion talking about anxiety and hope in the context of the pandemic. Is hope a positive emotion?
I think so, right? I think there's some evidence that people who, on average, experience more hope often cope with negative events better. I think in that way, there's some research that implicates hope in kind of the resilience process, right? And I think it really has to do with the fact that hope is an experience you're a lot more likely to feel when you feel some sense of control, right? And when you feel some sense of control, I think you often are empowered to deal with negative situations a little bit more proactively, right? As opposed to feeling helpless or, that whatever's going to happen is going to happen. And so I think because of that, there's evidence that hope leads to, on average, better outcomes. Now, I think it's an interesting question, right? In that, does hope continue to be good in a situation where maybe you really don't actually have a lot of
Yeah.
control? And I think that's an interesting philosophical question. But I think in most situations that people find themselves in, they have at least some limited span of control, right? And so I think that's why hope is often a beneficial emotion. It helps them to think about what they can control and what they can affect in a way that will lead to better outcomes for them.
Yeah, it strikes me that hope is generally a good thing, and unless I'm thinking about my eldest son who was working at a pet shop, and the owners would say how great everything was going and how terrific a job he was doing, and then he went into work one day and the whole store was gone. Midnight move. They just took off and that was it. They were gone and they never told him. And so it's that much more devastating when you've led
Yes.
with the hope for that length of time when there obviously was none and clearly they weren't doing very well, right?
Yeah.
So another thing that you mentioned is that although women and men lead in different ways and, use different emotions and that they're judged differently based on those emotions. And I presume that's not just by the people higher than them, but also by the subordinates that they lead, that they have a different perception of that leader based on their gender. I wonder if you could tell me a little bit more about that. What does the research say about, should you be sort of, I guess, regulating your emotion
Yeah.
to fit with the perceptions that your subordinates or that your leaders may have? Or is there a better way to do that?
Yeah, so I think that's really interesting. There is definitely research both on how people perceive leaders' emotion and also research on how people perceive leaders' behaviors, often kind of separate literatures. There's a lot of evidence that, particularly when it comes to gender, that people tend to censure and dislike women who express what we will call like dominance related emotions. So it's generally seen as inappropriate for women to be angry versus men, or for women to often experience demonstrate a lot of pride. These kind of emotions are often seen as when the research suggests that when women kind of demonstrate or kind of show, these emotions, that people react more negatively to them than men. So it seems like emotional displays are very much regulated in the same way that a lot of other behaviors are, in that there are, things that according to gender roles that are like more versus less okay for men and women to do. And even emotional expression is one of them.
Right.
Yeah, which is interesting. Yeah.
And you say that, and I'm thinking maybe the psychology itself perceives women a little bit differently in this context. You say that a lot of classical psychological things that we've thought to be true for a long time, theories, may not apply to women in this context. And I'm wondering if that's because for many, many years, the studies of people in leadership have by default been studies of white, male, cisgendered, heterosexual men who were in those positions of power for decades upon decades. And nobody really thought that women would ever be in those positions when they started those classical studies.
Yeah, I think that is a really good point. And I think even within psychological research, there's a tendency for the default to still be men in a lot of ways. So for example, if I'm starting out a line of research and I'm have to pick, I'm doing an experiment, I have to present a scenario, I have to present an individual, that I'm asking participants to evaluate. A lot of times people will be like, well, let's start with a guy still, right?
Right.
In order to control things, we don't want to jump right into it and kind of manipulate gender in this study. The default is the man, right? And so often our first explorations or our first studies to understand a phenomenon is often based on men. And I think to your point, there continues to be often more men in leadership positions, especially at the upper echelons, less so over time now at the lower levels, right? And so when we're asking subordinates their perceptions of their leaders, sometimes we're asking them about the perceptions of men still, right? I do think though that, there is some evidence that what people want from their leader is changing over time. There's a recognition that people often want leaders who are a little bit more compassionate and caring, though it is interesting in that when you force people to choose in a paradigm that kind of like uses money, for example, in terms of like, how much would you spend for a leader that was, intelligent versus a leader that was kind? If you only had like X amount of money in your pocket, what we do find then as under those circumstances is that although people will say that, kindness is really important, if they had to choose, then they will say, okay, I still, intelligence is a must-have. Kindness
Right.
is a nice to have, right? So although, I think our conceptualization of what it means to be a leader and a good leader is changing in a way that I'm hopeful will make them become more inclusive, I think that mostly holds true when resources are abundant and we're not under stress, and
Mhm.
when we have the kind of the time and space to be our best selves. I think we often realize that being a good leader requires both kinds of characteristics. But when we aren't, then we often default, I think, to some of these stereotypes where we're like, okay, but like,
Right.
maybe if I had to choose, then I'd rather still pick the more dominant masculine leader.
You say in your article that transformational leadership tends to be communal. Is that what you mean by communal? The, kindness, the niceness, the thinking about you as a person, not as an
Yeah.
employee, or more so than as an employee, right?
Yeah, transformational leadership is interesting in that it has both components. It definitely has a communal component in that it is about part of transformational leadership, as you say, is very much about knowing what your subordinates want and need and finding ways to help them get that as they do their work, and as an important source of motivation, right? But, transformational leadership also incorporates some aspects that people would say maybe airs a little bit more traditionally masculine. It is also about challenging people, to think about new ideas critically. So, but transformational leadership, I think, has both components, though I think what draws a lot of people in is kind of this interpersonal aspect in terms of really feeling known by your leader. But there are other pieces too, including the importance of being really visionary and, charismatic, which in some ways also requires leaders to be somewhat in touch with their emotions.
You say that women tend to be more likely to demonstrate these transformational traits, the communal leadership, this sort of thing.
These behaviors, yes.
The behaviors that would be considered this, right? Mm-hmm. But that they get rewarded for it on a much lesser basis than do men. When men display these traits, they tend to get promoted. They tend to move up into positions of leadership, whereas that doesn't seem to happen at all for women because we're judging them on the gender, right? That we're perceiving what they are doing differently. I'm guessing, right?
I think some of the research would suggest that it's because some of these behaviors are just expected of women, right? So like because of our stereotypes that women should care, when women do care, we're like, okay, good, meets our expectations, right? But nothing to write home about. But because I think men are often not subject to this expectation to care, sometimes there's this effect where it's like, oh, there's this man who cares, and everyone's like, let's throw him a ticker tape parade, right? What an extraordinary leader. So I think it also has to do with kind of the different standards we sometimes hold leaders to, and that, sometimes a lack of expectation can work in people's favors, whereas kind of these high expectations can sometimes undermine women because it doesn't give them credit in some ways for the behaviors that they're engaging in. It's like, okay, well, that's what you should be doing, without recognizing that, it's just as hard for men and women often to be doing these behaviors.
Yeah. And I'm thinking, you go into your performance review with your boss, and that's not something that's going to come up, right? The idea that you're kind to coworkers, or right, it might come up if you're specifically unkind, but the rest of it's sort of an expectation. And I'm wondering, we were just talking about this in an upcoming podcast episode about conflict resolution in the workplace. And if you're extremely good at that, it doesn't really get reflected in your performance review, or in the pay raise that you might or might not get, or in the promotion that you may or may not get, because there's really no metric to measure how well you do at conflict resolution, or how much of these leadership traits that you display. Is there maybe a way that we can start thinking about that differently without necessarily having, unless you can think of a metric that we can create to put that, into a quantifiable performance review type of situation?
Yeah, that's really tricky. I think that's tricky in two ways. I mean, one way to get around it with leadership behaviors is that to some extent, it looks like people can judge those. But I think maybe then you might be better off asking people to judge or report what their leaders actually did, as opposed to what we often do, which I think is one step removed, which is how you evaluate their leaders. Because I think that's where a lot of your standards come in terms of just like, oh, like, should they get credit for that or not, which sometimes can be wrapped up in gender stereotypes. So I think instead of being like, how effective is this leader, you might be better off using some kind of more concrete things, like how often does your leader check in with you? Where I think people might have a little bit more accuracy, even though if you just ask them to kind of summarize all these behaviors and come to a judgment, they may end up doing that in a relatively gendered way. So I think one way of getting around it maybe is to ask people about the behaviors themselves. Some people would say even that can be problematic, that sometimes people are more or less likely to notice certain kind of behaviors in a gendered way in terms of who does them or not. But I think it still gets us a little bit closer, if imperfect.
You mentioned in this study that, obviously most of it, I think, took place in the Netherlands, if I'm correct, right? And so most of the leaders are white people, still predominantly men, but, there were enough women to make the sample work. And you acknowledge that, you don't have any non-binary people. There are very few LGBTQ people in positions of leadership in this circumstance. And that's somewhere that you can explore later on, you also mentioned different cultures, right? And the idea that some other cultures approach things very differently. Specifically compared Germany and Nigeria, which I thought were two like such vastly different things. And it seemed like random. It seemed like you were doing one of those Mad Libs and just putting in countries.
Oh.
Why Germany and Nigeria? What's the difference there?
So it's really interesting. That wasn't random. It's actually based on some research that one of my colleagues, who we worked together on this paper on, so they did a cross-cultural study that focused on Germans and Nigerians. And I think it's really interesting in that all three elements that we studied could be different in these contexts, right? There's definitely evidence that gender stereotypes are different, but also emotional display rules are often different across countries. We can all think about, cultures where people seem much less emotionally expressive and other cultures where people seem much more emotionally expressive, right? But leadership norms are also different across cultures, right? Which is interesting in that, in particular, I think some of these negative leadership behaviors vary a lot across cultures in that I think the explanation for them tends to be different. I think in some more hierarchical cultures, a leader being kind of rude to you or authoritarian to you is either seen as more okay or sometimes even potentially interpreted as designed to motivate you, right? A tough love kind of belief.
Right.
Whereas I think in other cultures, it's seen as kind of very inappropriate and hurtful. So I think all the elements that we studied could really vary across cultural contexts, which makes it really interesting, but also difficult to predict exactly what would happen, what would generalize or not, given all these different factors. But I think that is one of the things that we do recognize is that although we find this in some contexts, it could be somewhat different in other cultural contexts, given these somewhat pretty, significant differences in norms across all of these things across different cultures.
For sure. Now, we have just about 5 minutes left, so I want to close with just one thing, which is that when we're recording this, and I'm not quite sure when it's going to be published yet, but at the time of recording, we are leading up to a fairly significant election in the United States, where the leadership styles of a man versus a woman are in stark contrast at the moment. And a lot of the talk that I see, specifically about Kamala Harris and the way that she is perceived as a leader, still holds on to a lot of these gendered stereotypes. It still talks a lot about emotion and, emotional regulation, and we can't have someone emotional doing things. And it's such an ingrained stereotype that even though we have evidence that it's not a real one, how do we go about telling people, talking to people in a way that starts to break down that stereotype? I'm sure we're not going to do it in the 1 month that we have before this election takes place. But, I'm just thinking about it in that context and seeing how ingrained it really is in people, in the media, in folks who should know better a lot of the time.
Yeah. I think that, I would encourage people to start to look at emotions and emotional control separately. So I would say, and I think a lot of people's concern is not emotions, but it's actually emotional control. And so my ask to them would be, are you actually seeing any evidence that these candidates differ in emotional control? And if so, I would say in what direction, right? Who's actually, exhibiting a lack of emotional control, right? In terms of when, not only if they're angry, but they're letting their anger affect their subsequent performance or their answers, or they lash out, right? And I would encourage them to be like, focus on that if you think that that is an important for you characteristic of a good leader. Then don't focus on emotions broadly. Really look to see what evidence you have around emotional control, since that seems to be more of actually what you're concerned about.
And I think that's good advice for regular life as well, right? Because I think a lot of the time we sort of assume someone has emotions or is experiencing an emotion of some kind, even if we can't see it and we don't know necessarily. And so what you're talking about is when it's very clearly and vividly on display, that's the emotional control portion of it. And the rest of it, you really don't know what someone's feeling or thinking or experiencing.
Yeah, people can definitely regulate and modulate their emotions, and so I think that, on the flip side, sometimes someone showing you their emotions is a attempt to be really genuine, and so I think that's also important to keep in mind too, is that emotions, I think, do convey a lot of information. The problem is, I think, we're not always good about focusing on what the emotion is actually conveying. And sometimes we overinterpret, that, if this person's really mad, that means they're about to lose it. Sometimes people are mad, legitimately so, but that doesn't mean that they've lost all sense of reason, as a result.
Well, thank you so much. And where does the research go from here? What's the next project after this one?
Yeah, I'm not sure, but I am very interested in this emotional labor idea and trying to understand if women are regulating their emotions differently, understanding hopefully ways in which, understanding if that is costly, and if so, understanding ways we can help women to mitigate that cost as much as possible.
Wonderful. Well, once you've got that done, I would love to have you back on and discuss that a little more further. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today. This was great. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me, Eric. I really appreciate it.
Thanks to you at home for listening, streaming, and downloading today's episode. Mindful is written, hosted, and published by me, Eric Bowman. Our producer and editor is Jamie Montgomery, and our theme music is Avenues by David Taylor.